So for this ruins demo, first thing is I'm going to bring in the ruins package. So I will right click, import package, custom package, navigate to where I've saved it, and here is this ancient environment, and click open. It brings up the menu showing everything in that, essentially a zip folder. It's a Unity package, which is like a Unity version of a zip. And now this is going to need to sync for a little while because it's quite a large package. So you can see if I expand it, there's quite a few things in here and a lot of models with textures. It will take a little while. So I'm going to click, I'm not changing anything, just everything is remaining ticked. I'm going to click import. And we can see what we've got here is this ancient environment folder. So this is the package, and it's come in with a big collection of various elements that we can use. Now before we start populating these, we want to build a terrain. So we're going to make an environment that we can walk around on. And the reason I wanted to bring in this package before we started building our terrain is that it has underground. So if I've expanded the ancient environment and then I expand ground, we have a lot of textures here for creating ground, which will be really useful in our terrain. So we'll use this to build up our ground, and then we'll go through and add environment pieces. So let's build a terrain before we worry about this ancient environment. And that's very simple. It's a game object, just like everything else that's in our game object. It's a 3D object. And if I come into the options, we have terrain. When I click it, you can see down here, if I hit F, it's built this terrain. And by default, it's quite a massive terrain. What I can do, we haven't got any textures on it at the moment. You can see it's checkers. Let's just quickly sculpt a little bit of shape onto it. We can see under the terrain setting, we have this little pull down menu for, at the moment it's set to raise or lower terrain. Often you'll want it set to paint texture, but the first option I want, so I've got the paintbrush selected, and I want raise or lower terrain. So this uses these paintbrushes as a height map. So as I paint on my object, I can pick different types of brushes, and you can see what it does. If I just click once, makes that little hill. These softer sort of brushes seem to make a bit more sense. And I'm going to hit square to make quite a large brush, and I'm just making like a mountain range with a flat section in the middle. So I'll make these quite large. Get a little bit of variety in there so it's not all identical, and I can, oops, deselected it. I can hit square to start customizing if I want. Just reselect it if you accidentally click off it. And I might just get a little bit of height in the center there so it's not all completely flat. We can zoom in and see what we've got here is this mountain range type thing. Now in the center, I'm just going to make a flatter section. I can decrease the opacity. I just kind of don't want to go that much. Let's really decrease that opacity. I'm just wanting to flatten that a little bit. By the way, if I hold shift, what it does is push down. If I go to the exact center actually and make this quite small, let's just do that. Hold shift and just make a really flat section. What you'll find is it goes to the maximum, or in this case minimum depth. So it's set to not be able to go any lower than that. So I intentionally want this really flat bit in the section. This is a good idea to give us the look of scale. So now what I want to do is look at the model in game and see what it actually looks like. Let's get rid of the standard camera. So I've just selected that in the hierarchy, hit delete. I've got my FPS controller, I'll drag that into my scene, and we get a sense straight away of the scale of this scene. I'm just going to click maximize on play and go full screen, hit the play button, and here we are in the middle of our checker world, and we get a sense of just how gigantic these terrains are. And hold down shift, and it's going to take a little while to run to the edge. Probably should go to the closer edge, but it looks like what I've done, turn that volume down a bit, what I've done is create this wall that's just so steep I can't actually climb up it. most likely. So let's get to the edge, and we can see I can climb up it, okay. So that would be a case of if you're making a game where you don't want the player to climb up, you would need to, and I'm hitting space to jump, you'd need to get into the code and start manipulating how it behaves, or you could just look at what's called the physics material. So it's got a material applied to it that isn't a texture, it's about the physics of the object. And, whether it's slippery or grippy or whatever. But you get a sense very quickly of the scale of these terrains. It's just a nice way to quickly build a scene that's a bit more interesting than a simple plane with cubes. The terrains are much better. But the checkers are not very appealing, so let's select our terrain and the paintbrush. Now it's set to raising or lowering the terrain, in other words, painting our terrain settings. And if I wanted to, I could maybe just get just a little bit more. I'll turn the opacity right down, a little bit more variety down the base, just so we're not completely flat. And just quickly do something. A bit more interest, that's fine. And the player controller, let's hit F to focus on him. I'll just hit W and just make sure he's not floating halfway through the ground. I usually like it to have a slightly above the ground, so you can see when I hit play, it does fall a touch and then it hits the ground. But now we've got just a little bit more visual interest in the distance, but let's change the textures, or apply some textures. So I select my terrain, make sure the brush is selected, and I'm changing raising or lowering terrain from that option, the little pull down here, to paint texture. So I can paint in textures at this point. And what it's saying is paint the selected material layer onto the terrain texture. Well, what's the selected material layer? We haven't got one at the moment. Terrain layers are empty. So I'm going to say edit terrain layers, add layer, and just layer 1, new layer. And so this is using our standard terrain layer, which has a material on it. I can click on this layer. We can see what it's got is some existing material. So this is our Unity standard material. So it certainly looks better than checkers for sure, but what I can do is change this. So I can go select, and in the search here I'm going to type in ground, and this is bringing up all of these ground textures from the ancient environment pack that we just brought in. So I'm going to pick, let's go ground 9. When I pick that, it changes everywhere. We can see it's tiling, and that tiling becomes very obvious. So really what you need to do at that point to deal with this tiling is start adding multiple terrain layers. You can add multiple elements to it, so there's more variety and it's not the same pattern repeated over and over. And you can also add more layers with things like grass and trees and rocks, and start adding elements to really build it up. This is the absolute building blocks of a game. Now, looking at this object, what we've got here is a texture called ground 9 and a normal map from a different texture. So what I'm going to do is grab the ground 9 normal map and apply that. And as soon as I do, you'll see the environment changes. So if I just hit select and I'll scroll right up to the top and go none, notice down here this looks very flat. So this is the material for my environment is just a picture of ground. It's just this ground 9 texture and nothing else. Notice when I drag the normal map that this will change to add more depth. So I find that ground 9 and there's ground 9 underscore NMP for normal map. I click and drag this onto the normal slot here, and notice the depth increases. So now when we play, we look down and we've got a much more interesting ground that we're standing on. And we can start to see a game of sorts coming together. So one more thing I'd like to do, without getting too crazy with terrains, is just improve the sky. Because we're looking up at a default sky, it's a bit boring. And all I'm going to do is go into the skies here, and we've got a collection, we've got 2 skies. And it's This 3D object, it's actually a material, is a skybox material, which has a cube selected of HDR images, high dynamic range images, that creates our two different skies. So in one we've got this ruined sky, and I can just click and drag it in, and it gives us this nighttime, interesting kind of moody feel. Or I can overlay that with any of these others. Kind of like that. It's a very deserty feel, isn't it? You can see it's got some really nice elements in this kit. And so that gives us a much more convincing element of a proper game. You know, once we've got a sky, the default blue, solid blue, looks pretty horrific compared to this sort of thing. And finally, let's just add a few objects to our scene. So we've got ruins. I'm just basically now able to jump in and start adding different elements. And it's kind of trial and error. It's a good way to go, is just quickly adding. So go with the whole numbers, don't go with the level of detail models. So this is block A, and then there's block A LOD, level of detail. I just want this block A whole number. I can just drag it into my scene, and it is literally just a cube. I can Control D to duplicate it and start making, maybe I want to make a couple of duplicates along here. Just make sure they're sitting on the ground. And if I'm setting up a scene, what we really should be doing is making a bit of variety. So I can scale them up a little bit. I don't want to go too much. If I scale this up, I'll just move it back so it's not intersecting, but if I scale this up enormously, look at that texture. That is distorting, because it's got the same texture regardless of the scale. Now, if everything was this size, it would be fine, but it looks really weird when you have an object that is a nice detailed texture next to an object that is quite low res by comparison. So just be aware of that. You can make small scales. You can see if I scale this a little bit, it's not that noticeable. We can get away with a little bit of variation. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is just change my scene to be a little bit more organic. You don't want things ever in CG to be perfectly symmetrical and duplicated over and over. You want to have a little bit of reality in your scene. So let's see, we've got a couple of cubes. Let's just look at what else we've got. Just randomly, little rocks running around. And then much larger ruins. So these are building blocks, these ruins. And it's kind of about working out. So remember I said if you hold down V, you can, so W for my move tool, hold down V and I can snap it. So I can start snapping these objects. So let's just put a couple up here. So just holding down V and snapping that up, and it quickly gives us the beginnings of a little scene. That appears to be something intended to float on top. Sit on the ground rather. So if I drag that up, you can see I've got holes in parts of the mesh. So you want to be careful how things connect. It's just trial and error, figuring out what parts I want to use, and start building up some kind of interesting environment. So this bit becomes fun. This is where it's basically set design. So it's a whole skill set in itself, environment design and laying out objects in a way that's appealing and interesting. You can spend a lot of time just practicing this with these sorts of kits over and over, and trying to recreate appealing scenes that you see in games. And it's not as easy as it looks when you see a professional game with people that are obviously pros that have been practicing it for many years. It's very difficult to, you can kind of take it for granted with just how much work goes into building, even just designing those sets. Someone that's not thinking about so much the modeling and texturing aspect of it, but just using other people's assets and laying them out in a way that's interesting and appealing. And trying to think a little bit outside the box. Like you might think, well, I could duplicate this and, I don't know, have a broken pillar standing over there. Or you could think, well, what if we've got one that's fallen down? And we're starting to create a little bit what's called mise-en-scene. It's a narrative, a story within the scene. So it's creating a little bit of a sense of, something's taken place here in some way, shape or form. In this case, there's ruins, there's things have fallen over, and we're trying to tell a little bit of a story to how our scene works. So yeah, that's basically the idea. We can sit there and start to build up how our scene should look. Just had that idea that this should kind of feel like it's part of this broken piece. There's no problem intersecting. If you decide that's what you want to do, like maybe I just want a part of a column that's through the ground, I can just drag that straight down through the ground. It doesn't have to be perfectly sitting on it. And that's nice because it gives it the sense of here's the rest of the column that has fallen down, and I don't know, maybe I've got some bits of rubble kind of like this. I'll just Control D to duplicate that. And you can see under the ground it's transparent. And, start to populate the scene with more interesting bits of variety. You'll notice these little green cubes around my model. All of my models have these green shapes. That's the collider. And so what that's allowing us to do is when I hit play, it's stopping. So in this case, that rock is gigantic. So it's like a couple of feet tall, and it's actually stopping me from walking over it. And these cubes are really big. And this is why we want to test. I need to test, is my jump, if I need the player to be able to jump up on top of this, I need to play test to make sure it works. Or if I'm looking at the scale in 3D and I walk up and think, before I start playing the game, if I think this is a certain height, if I think it's going to be this giant tower, and then I play the game and it's only like a couple of meters tall, the only way to know that is to play test and make sure everything looks the way you think it's going to look. If you want to see those rocks and you want the player to be able to walk over them instead of, like I'm getting this sort of blocking, probably doesn't translate that well to a video, but as I play, the controllers are sort of stalling as it hits that rock. I could just turn off the mesh colliders for those objects and still have the 3D mesh, and you'll see it. You can just walk straight through it. So yeah, that's basically the process for building a simple little game. You add enough elements and you can take a basic, simple terrain and a few environment pieces into a full-blown game with characters walking around and all sorts of functionality through components where characters, turn it into a Assassin's Creed style of thing if you have many years and many people working on the project for long enough. But at its core, that is game development and game design. So what I encourage you to do is go through and have a bit of fun with that. Just build up a little bit of a scene, get a sense for how we operate inside of Unity, how things work, and obviously analyzing more professional assets is a really nice thing to do as well as a 3D modeler. If your skill set is ultimately, if you want to be building these sorts of pieces for game environments, or even if it's less for games and more for animation and cinematics and things, or visual effects, it's still really useful, especially as a beginner, to analyze more professional level assets and get a sense of how these are built and assembled.